Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third in our climate change series for the One Tam annual symposiums. Before we get started, I want to introduce the behind-the-scenes technical folks who are with us to make today run. We've got Rob Laporte, Michelle Gentili, Marit O'Gallagher, and Samir Soriano, and Gracia Pacheco. And I'm going to do a quick share screen. And is that the right one? Oops. Slideshow. Start. Okay, I think we're up and running. All right, so my name is Janet Klein, and I am the Director of Conservation Science with the Golden Gate Parks Conservancy, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the One Tam Climate Symposium. Today, we're going to be looking at sea level rise. So before we really jump in, we want to know who's with us today. So if you could answer this quick poll, is this your first One Tam Symposium? Poll? Oh, there we go. Great, so we have about 30% of the folks who are here today, or 20% of the folks who are here today are here for their first time. So I'm going to do a quick review since if this is your first one, and tell you a little bit about who we are. So One Tam is not a standalone organization. It's actually a shorthand that we use to describe a partnership, a collaboration between the land management agencies that take care of Mount Tamalpais and its surrounding public lands. So it's California State Parks, Marin County Parks, the Marin Municipal Water District, the National Park Service, and then the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy is a nonprofit that kind of serves as a collective tissue and the glue within that partnership. And together we do work that crosses boundaries and addresses problems and issues that aren't restricted to one particular jurisdiction. And events like the symposium series that we're doing now are part of the collective work of that One Tam partnership. And if you want to learn more about the partnership, I suggest you check out our website. There's a really great video that you can find that gives you like a 6-minute overview of the work we do, and then you can do a deep dive into the different projects and programs that we have underway. So today is the third in a series of 5 3-hour webinars that we're hosting that focus on climate change, and it features the work of the One Tam partnership as well as and then places it within a regional context and draws in the work of others that support what we do here in Marin County. Today, we're going to feature climate change and we're going to feature sea level rise. And this issue, it's really interesting. We were speaking with Kate Sears yesterday, who will be one of our early speakers this morning. And she noted how sea level rise has lost its urgency, or its sense of urgency, has the issue of fires and extreme heat and coronavirus really, have dominated our landscape for the last year. But this is a very, very pressing issue within Marin County, and has today unfolds. You'll see the kind of the piece of the puzzle that the One Tam partners hold is relatively small compared to the scale of what's unfolding in front of us within the county, within the Bay Area, within the country, within the world. So again, if you take a moment to kind of reflect where you are, and we have another poll, is your home subject to flooding right now? And when you think about this, there are people who are facing tidal flooding, water coming in from the bay or water coming in from the ocean. And then there's the issue of creek flooding, those giant storm events. So just kind of let this tick on. And you can see that right now we're looking at really like about 80% of you are saying, no, this is an issue where you're not currently experiencing flooding. And I also want to note that we've got 4% of the respondents right now don't have a home. Homelessness and housing insecurity is an issue that's only going to become more exacerbated as sea level rise and fires accelerate. Whoops, can we end the poll? There we go. Whoops. And the poll is stuck. Okay, there we go. Page down. Next slide. Okay, so again, today is the third in our series. Next week, we'll be featuring resilient species and biodiversity. And then on October 29th, we're going to transition to local solutions. This is today's program. We're going to open with Jeremy Lowe from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, who's going to speak to sea level rise in Marin. And a lot of the technical information that we have available to us. Kate Sears is going to kind of speak to what it's like to be an elected official with responsibilities, with problems on the scale on the horizon or unfolding right now. We have a youth panel from the One Tam Link program are going to speak about their perspective on climate change. We'll take a break and then we'll turn to Douglas Mundo from the Multicultural Center in the Canal. Where they're really looking at like compounding multiple crises. And then we'll have a presentation on really exciting kind of developments that have happened around Ocean Beach in San Francisco. And then finally, Claire Mooney with the Golden Gate Parks Conservancy is going to take us home and speak specifically to the One Tam work. And then later tonight, If you're really interested in that One Tam work, and specifically around Bothene Marsh in the Mill Valley area, there's an hour-long presentation on the work that's going on there. We hope you join us. And I would like to note that on this, our third day of the series is also our third red flag alert. That's happened concurrent with our climate change series. So please pay attention to the temperature where you are, keep yourself tuned in for alerts. And if you haven't already registered for those emergency alerts on your cell phone, here's the link to Nixle where you can do that. And then last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge that I currently am sitting in Fairfax, and which is the part of the traditional lands of the Coast Miwok. Am I still doing, oops, I'm doing a share screen. Let me stop the share screen. And Michaela's gonna drop into the chat for us a link where you can look up where the indigenous lands are, the indigenous connections to the lands that you're sitting in right now. And I encourage you to do that and to learn more about both the historic indigenous connections and the contemporary connections of the people of the peoples of the lands where you live. And with that, I am going to introduce our first speaker, Jeremy Lowe with the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And where to go? So sorry, too many screens going today. So Jeremy is a senior environmental scientist with the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and he's going to speak in more detail today about sea level rise in Marin and what it means for our evolving shorelines. So please welcome Jeremy.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, great. Thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me. As Janet said, I'm a senior scientist at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. Regardless of my accent, I've been living in the Bay for the last 20 years, and I've been studying the wetlands. I've been working on wetland restoration and also on sea level rise. And so I'd like to tell you some things that have been happening on projects that I've been working in Marin, and also give you some information that you can take with you to read up on this further. I trust everybody can see the first slide, which is a picture of the title slide, and then the picture of Corte Madera. Is that correct?
Looks good.
Okay, so this is Marin. Obviously, is a great place to live. You have the bay, you have the mountains. And in the last part of the 20th century, developed a lot of areas close to the bay, and a lot of people live down there. Of course, now with sea level rise, we have to rethink about how we're living next to the bay. The bay is coming towards us, and this is a picture of Corte Madera, Mariner's Cove, looking at how on a king tide, one of the highest astronomical tides during the year, as a precursor, as a glimpse into the future about what we're going to have to be dealing with. And we need to be dealing with it in a managed way. Rather than have to deal with disaster and cleaning up after the flooding, we're trying to think ahead and think about what our vulnerabilities are and how we can adapt to those. So I'm going to take you back firstly about what sea level rise is driving this, because it is a very big global issue, and whilst it's the numbers are relatively small, we're talking about changes in relatively in feet and so on, because there's so much development close to the ocean, close to the bay, these have significant impacts on these low-lying areas. And what causes sea level rise is generally the expansion of the ocean. It's expanding because of heat. Heat directly from the sun is raising, because we're trapping more heat within the atmosphere because of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. But we're also melting ice, which is sitting on the land at the moment in glaciers and in Antarctica in particular, which is now entering the ocean. So it's like sitting with a drink and putting an ice cube in it. There can be rapid increases in the water level if you put a lot of ice in immediately. And those two things are really driving the amount of water going up, but also, as you know, in Marin and in the Bay Area, we have tectonic movements. We move up and down as well, occasionally with earthquakes. And also being in the Bay lands, there's subsidence because of changes to the bay compression of the mud. So these vertical movements of the water and of the land are driving our sea level rise, and that's what we're trying to manage. And we've always had this. We didn't notice it in the 20th century, in the 19th century. We're noticing it now and we're projecting bigger changes. And we've noticed it because we've taken lots of information from tide gauges and so on around the bay. And this is the only graph I'm going to show, but it stretches from 1890 on the left-hand side up to 2100 at the far right, and we're in the middle. We're at 2010 or 2020 here. And on the vertical scale, I've put the amount of sea level rise, the water levels measured at San Francisco Bay. And we've got a great advantage. We've got a long-term tide gauge out there. And you can see it's a black squiggly line. And those squiggly lines are things like storm surges, El Nino years. You can see the El Ninos in particular, these are the bigger spikes. We get about a foot more water in the bay then. But you can see gradually there's been like a 7-inch or 8-inch increase in sea level rise over the 20th century. What we're projecting, though, whilst that will continue, is projected to accelerate, and that's what the brown and the green dotted lines indicate. There are lots of different projections. I'm not going to claim that these are and we need to understand how we manage those. But the idea is that generally things are going to accelerate, and we're not certain. That's why there's two lines there. There's lots of lines. We're not certain about what the numbers are going to be, but we know they're going to be higher, and that's what we've got to that uncertainty is what we're going to have to manage. There's a great resource, the sea level rise guidance by the state. You go opc.ca.gov. All these links will be on in the resource page for this talk. But the general takeaway is the sea level rise by 2050 is expected to be a foot or so higher, and by the end of the century, 3 feet or so higher. And the general guidance from the state at the moment is we should be thinking about how to make our coasts, our bay, the Marin shoreline, resilient to sea level rise of at least 3.5 feet by 2050. So we're expecting 3.5 feet by then, but our projects, our communities, our infrastructure should be resilient to 3.5 feet. So that's a lot of words and graphs. So I'm going to illustrate sea level rise. This is the types of numbers we're talking about. Today, we were standing on the shoreline, say down in Richardson Bay. By 2050, it's going to be up to our knees. By 2100, probably up to our armpits. But the really important thing is it's going to continue into the future. Everything we do is an adaptation, but there's no final solution onto this. There's no silver bullet. We're going to have to continue dealing with this. On future generations, we're going to have to continue dealing with this. So we talked about things in the vertical. You can also explore the impacts of sea level rise on this viewer that BCDC have provided, the Flood Explorer viewer. And again, there's a link to that, which allows you to look at those different elevations that I showed you, the 1 foot, the 3 feet, and so on, and look at it in conjunction with storms and see what the areas that will be affected. And this is I just set this for 3 feet for Marin. The blue areas are those that will get wet if the levees fail or if they get overtopped. And of course, our levees don't do that. We have flood control districts. We have engineers who maintain and manage those levees, and they keep us safe. But looking ahead, because of the increase in sea level, we need to maintain those, and we need to raise those, and we need to think about how else we can adapt to sea level rise, because these are not exact. We're used to having a fixed bay in terms of elevation, and that's going to change. So let's zoom in on an area. Here's Corte Madera and San Rafael, and you can see there's large amounts of the area which aren't going to get wet, and that's because there are hills. The areas that will get wet are the areas between the hills in the valleys, because those valleys filled up with marshes over the time. When in the 1850s people came along, and there's a lot of marshes there. Firstly, they built railroads and roads through them, but then more recently in the last century, particularly after the Second World War, those areas were areas which could be developed and people could build their houses on. And you can see this. You can see this in Corte Madera. This is an aerial shot from 1926, and you can see the marshes at Corte Madera. You can see Corte Madera Creek wandering up toward into the background. The red line is the old railroad alignment. So the town center shopping mall is just behind that, and that white line is a precursor to Highway 101. So keep this image in mind. All this marsh in this area. And this is what it is today. The red line is the railroad. You can see Highway 101 at the back. You can see how Corte Madera has expanded into the marshes. And you can see the places like Mariners Cove and Marina Village, right up close to the bay. And they did this by filling the bay, by placing fill on those areas. So firstly, they started at a low elevation because they were building on the marsh. And secondly, they put a lot of fill on those areas, which is heavy and compresses the marsh. So they tended to subside. And this isn't just Corte Madera. These are the San Rafael, the Canal District, Novato. Lots of these areas have the similar issues. And those are the issues we need to deal with. So we have flooding issues today, and these are going to get worse with sea level rise. So let's go down to Richardson Bay. Again, Richardson Bay, you can see Coyote Creek. You can see the on-ramp to Sausalito. I'm sure you parked at the airport, a parking lot, and every so often get turned away because there's flooding in that area. And just in this area as well is the Sausalito on-ramp to 101, which regularly gets flooded. This is a picture of a king tide, that highest astronomical tide during the year, when there is, as a precursor of of sea level rise, where this is the type of about a foot above normal tides, and so this might be something we might expect to see in 2030, 2040 time, as a regular occurrence, not just as a one-off photo opportunity. And of course, we also have bigger immediate issues, more photogenic ones even, which is up at Highway 37, which is, as you know, in 2017, in January 2017, and previously has been flooded as levees have failed, and there has been several weeks of flooding whilst those have been fixed. And Highway 37 and those big pieces of infrastructure that we have are vulnerable to sea level rise. They're in the same low-lying areas as the communities, and so they're equally vulnerable to sea level rise. So when we look up at the Novato area where Highway 37 is, we can see these blue areas, which are mainly hayfields at the moment, are potentially vulnerable to sea level rise. So we start at the bottom. We've got Santa Venetia and Las Galinas. Those communities down there are vulnerable. Moving up, we have Hamilton Airfield restoration and the Hamilton community, which has just had a big levee constructed to accommodate sea level rise. We have Belmarine Keys right in the middle of the historical marshes, which is now right in the middle potentially of flooded areas. And of course, we have Highway 37 running, that red line you can see running right across here, running right through. And Highway 37 is an interesting example of a road which kind of, you wonder why they built it quite like that, apart from the fact it's a straight line between two places. This is a historical map of the area. Actually, this is between Petaluma and Sears Point. The Petaluma River on the right, on the left-hand side, and Sears and Sonoma Creek on the right, and Sears Point in the middle. I chose this because it's actually the nicer of looking at the maps, but it's the same general idea. What they did, there was early diking of this area. They then built the road right through it. So you can see Highway 37 eventually comes through here and joins up with Lakeville and 121. So they built right across those historical marshes. Those marshes have been diked by farmers. So the farmers had just used earth embankments to do it. They weren't thinking somebody's going to build this big road behind it. And then we look today, and you can see Novato Creek now in the bottom left-hand corner, and Petaluma in the middle, and the red line of Highway 37. The areas that are blue get wet today. The areas that are green are protected by levees and would get wet if there weren't levees. They would get wet every day. So these are very low-lying areas. And these levees stretch up for a long distance and are really maintained by farmers and people who necessarily have an interest in the whole area. And there are a number of places in here which are very vulnerable and we need to start to manage. So when we're thinking about managing for sea level rise, we need to think about managing perhaps levees and areas which are quite distant from where we live, because the water can route its way in quite through quite long distances. So those green areas are quite significant in Nevada. It's interesting how Highway 37 is the only road that crosses the marshes. You see Lakeville Highway, 121, Atherton Avenue, 101, they all skirt around the edges. That's why Highway 37 is such a prominent sea level rise indicator. And those levees that we have are really important. We're going to talk about nature-based adaptation as well, but levees are going to be really important for us. And we have a lot of them, and we don't always look after them. And don't worry about it. This is not Marin, this is Hayward. But I wanted to show you this because I got two photos which are interesting about this. One is, this is what we normally think about it. You know, riding a bike along the Bay Trail, admiring the view, low tide, everything's quite quiet. But levees are designed for this kind of condition. This is a New Year's Day 2005 storm. And this is when firstly there's a storm surge, so the water elevation in the bay is higher, but there's also waves, and the waves are coming over the top of the levee and causing some flooding, but damage. But the levee is basically doing its job. We have a lot of situations like this around the bay. There's situations like this in Marin, and this is the kind of conditions that we need to deal with: sea level rise plus storm surge plus waves. So to get some idea, this is if anybody's been following Highway 37, there's been a lot of good policy discussions, public meetings about this. So that's a good way to keep track of sea level rise in the North Bay. You can see how the design elevations they're using at the moment. This is the elevation of the land at Novato Creek, is about 6 foot above mean low water, above datum, and so it's quite low when compared to the tide range, which is about the same. As I said, you know, if you take down the levees, you're going to get wet. You add onto that the 100-year storm surge, which it's about 3 foot. You're going to get. We don't get hurricanes here. We're on the wrong coast, or in the right coast for that. But you're going to get storm surges of 3 feet or so. So we've got to deal with those. We also have waves. Waves about 3 feet as well. And then on top of that, so you can see at the moment we're quite low. We need to build levees at least that high. We need to build structures like road elevations at least that high to do something. But with sea level rise, we've got to add in, say, 3.5 feet more to accommodate that. So you can see that the structures we have are too low. The land is too low at the moment. We need to think about how to raise that efficiently and economically and keep business working at the same time. So I'm going to stop here about vulnerability. You can follow up on this. The two great efforts by the county. One's called Sea Smart, which is the open coast, ocean area vulnerability, and the Baywave, the equivalent, the sister project called Baywave, which was for the bay side of Marin. They talk about the vulnerability of all the communities and all the areas, and you can look at these, and they give you ideas about when things are going to happen and how they might be affected, and what people are thinking about doing. So those are two great resources to look at. What I'm now going to do is talk, instead of the gloomy ideas of vulnerability, I was thinking about the adaptation and what we can do. Traditionally, we built levees, seawalls, hard structures, which are great. They do their job with great certainty. They're not very adaptable or dynamic, and they also don't necessarily play well with nature. And because we invested so much effort into nature in the bay since the 60s with the McAteer Petrus Act, with Save the Bay, and all the great restorations that have been happening, and Marin's seen a lot of those, we're looking in the future to try and meld together traditional levees and hard structures with nature as well. So we're kind of trying to get the benefits of both. Because particularly, as I pointed out, sea level rise is going to continue to rise. We've got to think of a more dynamic, adaptable shoreline than we've had in the past. We can't draw a hard line in the sand anymore and say no more, no, water doesn't cross this. We're going to have to say, well, there's an area here where we're going to slowly, the sea is going to come in. Where when we go to pick out to, we're going to have to pick where we're going to have those fights. And we've got examples all through Hamilton, all through Marin, of where people have been starting to think about sea level rise and marsh restoration. So this is an example. This is Hamilton Airfield in Nevada. And on the left is the artist impression of 2002, when I worked on this in 2002. And it shows the Hamilton community. It shows a big levee protecting them along there. It shows a large amount of fill being placed into that area from dredging, particularly from Oakland Harbor by the Corps of Engineers, and then the Coastal Conservancy's project to restore the marshes. And this was the idea. And then this is about 2014, 15, just before breaching. But it's breached now, but it shows the amount of work that transition from an airfield with a big runway into it to a wetland, and a wetland that was designed to accommodate sea level rise. You also start seeing things, little pilot projects around Marin. It's at San Rafael, at the end of the canal, you'll find these oyster reefs, which have been put in by San Francisco State University. They're looking at the role of oysters and oyster reefs in providing not just habitat for oysters, but in how waves can be attenuated or reduced by using these as almost like small breakwaters as well. So getting double duty out of a habitat and a wave protection. And they've also been looking at eelgrass, and they've been looking at a number of different issues or projects at the toe of the marsh, outside of the marsh, on the mudflats. Also, instead of just marsh, there were historically beaches, and there still are in a number of places in Marin, and particularly within the headlands, in the pocket beaches. And this is an example of this is actually a constructed beach at Arambaroo Island, which the Audubon led, and was an example of using a natural feature, creating a natural feature to reduce erosion, to reduce wave impacts, which we're going to see more of as sea level rises, and incorporate, and also restore a type of habitat which has been missing a lot from the bay. So again, there's an example here. There are now a number of projects which are now being designed, which have learned from these examples and are now being put into Marin. And the county has been, Roger Leventhal at the county has been working on a lot on those types of beaches. So you should see more of these. And we should think about the other end, behind the marsh. Behind the marsh, generally in Marin, we have places like San Rafael and Corte Madera and so on. We have towns and cities. But historically, we used to have obviously a transition between the marsh and the upland areas, and that allowed the marsh to move into these areas. It provided habitat. It's valuable habitat in its own right. It's the transition between wetlands and uplands. It provides refuge for species such as the ridge-rayed rail and the salt marsh harvest mouse during storms and so on. But in the longer term, these are areas where we should think about how to allow, if the bay is expanding, how do we allow our marshes to move, and how do we allow that bay to expand? Now, we can't do that in many places because we have a levee in place. So the China Camp is probably one of the few places we have that in Marin, naturally. But we can emulate it. We can mimic that. If we have a levee, a flood risk management levee in place, such as in this bottom diagram, we can build a longer slope in front of it, which could mimic those wetland upland transitions, provide the same type of services, and buy us more time before the marshes really get crunched up against the flood risk management levee. And so those are ideas that are starting to be thought of at both in Marsh and at Corte Madera Marsh. Obviously, we don't want to place a whole lot of material onto the existing marsh and bury the very thing that we're trying to protect. So we've got to be clever about how we do that. But thinking about how we can change the landscape is an important piece that we can do. And I want to point you to the Adaptation Atlas that we produced at SFEI, which talks about a lot of these types of not just continuing work as we've been doing in the past, but thinking up new ideas, new pilot projects, new ways of managing the shoreline. That's online. It provides a lot of information around the whole bay, a lot of information on Marin. And in that project, we separated up the landscape into a series of 30 blocks, 30 areas, which are not cities or counties, which we normally divide the bay up into. They're physical units which relate to the processes and the landscape that we have. And in the future, when we're dealing with sea level rise, cities and towns are going to have to work together with counties, because nature doesn't necessarily follow their jurisdictional boundaries, it follows its own. And so what we try to do is point out where those nature's boundaries are and the types of adaptation that could go there. So I point you to that as increasing that discussion. But I just point out for example, for Novato, instead of just doing a restoration project such as Hamilton down in the bottom right-hand corner, this is the whole of the historical baylands of Novato. These are all the areas that could get wet with sea level rise. And instead of thinking of just one project, we're thinking about a vision of what that area could look like if it was more resilient to sea level rise. So instead of just the restorations at the bottom, we've also got raising areas adjacent to Highway 37, maybe raising the whole road, thinking about how stormwater, freshwater is coming in from Novato and the flooding you get up there and how that could be dissipated. Thinking about how to protect the people in Belmarine Keys. Are there joined up projects here that we can really have multiple benefits, not just in one place, but providing protection for further back into the system, so in a long-term resilient landscape. But of course, all that takes time. And this is coming to my last slides now, is a timeline of when we should do things. And this timeline is different. It's got time in feet of sea level rise, not years of our lives. And really, it's saying, how should we adapt over time? We don't know exactly when sea level rise is going to reach certain elevations, but when we do, we need to have a plan for it. So our existing marshes can accommodate sea level rise, maybe a foot or so. But at some point, we're going to have to think about there's a limit where there's a threshold we reach where we think, okay, we need to really kind of start intervening here. And maybe we put those reefs in, or we place sediment onto marshes to raise them up. But all of that takes time. You've got to get designed, you've got to raise the money, you've got to get permits. And so if you're going to do something, then we know from experience, you've got to be like 10 years out to get that all together before it's effective and implemented. And so you have to have a decision made pretty soon, maybe an inch or two from now. But that's only going to last a certain amount of time. There's no silver bullet. That sea level rise is going to continue. It's probably going to accelerate. So you're going to think of something more drastic. So something more drastic might be those big horizontal levees that I was talking about at Corte Madera or in both in Marsh. Thinking about that. We haven't built many of those. So obviously, they're probably going to be expensive. So there's got to be a lot of design. There's got to be a lot of thought put into those. Again, you're going to have to start thinking about those sooner rather than later. But again, there's a limit to how much you can do. If sea level rise projections get really bad, we're going to have to think of even more discussion, not just will we be able to hold that levee line, or will we need to think about how to move that? And of course, that's a very big societal discussion to have. But we have time, but we need to start having that discussion now, because waiting for it when the water's actually there is a bit too late. So you can see like there's a transition of ideas, and these are just one set of ideas. There's lots of different ideas you could try out, but we need to have these discussions now. It's exactly what this symposium is about. Otherwise, this is a picture of China Camp, and you can take this picture anytime on a king tide out there, people driving through the water. This is bay water now crossing the North San Pedro Road. We don't want to be in this situation. It's too late to adapt at this point. So with that, I'll finish. These are great resources about sea level rise, about the bay habitats in general, the Bayland Goals update that's online, the Adaptation Atlas is online, and then I think the first thing you should do is go and find out where your house is on the BCDC Flood Explorer.
Thank you, Jeremy. Michaela, do we have time for questions?
I think we've got about 1 minute for questions.
Hey, Rob, what have we got in the Q&A?
Okay, it looks like we've got one question. It's, to what extent is creek and river flooding linked to sea level rise and coastal flooding?
Oh, it's a very important question. What they call combined flooding, or that's the flooding that we receive from the creeks, and it's exacerbated by the level of the bay. What the bay does, if we have a large rain event and there's a lot of water coming down the creeks, and the bay level is high, the bay acts like a dam to stop the water coming out of the creeks, and the water in the creeks backs up particularly through the urban areas. And as sea level rises, that's going to become more and more important. So there is a very important connection between the bay and the creek flooding that we need to address. And in a lot of areas around the bay, that's going to be the first signs we see of sea level rise. Not necessarily water coming in over the levee at the bay edge, but it's increased flooding in the communities along the creeks.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Jeremy. Really helpful. And for folks who are asking, yes, we'll be making all of these presentations available, although it might be a week or two before we have them up and posted. But thank you so much. I learned a tremendous amount just now. Really appreciate it.